Everyone, what's up? And welcome back to another episode here with some Pot Limit Omaha content. Great to have you back here today. Hope you are all doing fine. And today it's all about how to adjust and play correctly against limpers. If you play low stakes PLO, if you play in games where there are a lot of recreational players, or if you play in live games, then make sure to watch this video until the end, because today I'm going to show you some of the realizations you should have when you play against players who do limp, and also how you can adjust correctly against these type of players. Now, as you already see behind me, I opened up my database and I am replaying hands where I was facing one or more limpers. So in the meantime, while I am addressing this topic, check out some of these big hands. Now also make sure to subscribe to the channel if you do enjoy this type of content. Please like the video if you do so at the end, and also turn on that notification bell so you are first to watch my most latest videos. That being said, let's jump right into today. It's about limping and playing against limpers, of course. Now, if you play low stakes, which many of you do, or if you are new to the game, then you will experience this a lot. You will face one opponent or multiple opponents before you who do enter the pot with a passive action, basically coming in for the limp, and you have to decide whether you either fold, maybe also limp, or raise it up. Now, and it's important to realize whenever this happens is that if you do face a limper or maybe even more limpers, in general, you will have very, very little fold equity. And the reason that you have so little fold equity if you do raise it up against a limper is because people who limp, they like to see flops. They want to see as many flops as possible. The strategy is just to play a pot as cheaply as possible by limping. They don't have to invest that much money, and they really want to see a flop and try to hit something. So if they then face someone that basically ISO raises, they don't really care about the additional money that they have to invest. Yes, they have to invest more than by only limping, but they still are going to call 99 out of 100 times here. It is just the game flow. It's just the way these players perceive the game and how they play, and therefore don't expect to have a lot of fold equity or almost any fold equity if you ISO raise. Something else that happens a lot in limped pots and in games where there are a lot of limpers is that if you raise it up after your opponent limps, it is very likely that there are people behind you who do enter the pot as well by calling, and therefore you end up in a multi-way pot quite often. Don't expect if you do ISO raise versus a limper that you are guaranteed to play a heads up pot in position. It's actually very often the case that you will end up in a multi-way pot instead of in a heads up pot. So keep those two things already in mind. First of all, you have little fold equity if you raise, and secondly, there is still a very high chance that you will end up playing a multi-way pot. And this especially is even more true if you ISO raise from middle position or the cutoff, and there are more like 3-4 people behind you who can still come in. Now, of course, if you do play against people who like to limp a lot and see flops cheaply this way, it's very likely that you are up against a recreational player. So that is always good to think about. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that either you have fold equity pre-flop or that you will just play a pot only versus him. Yes, it's a recreational player, but keep those things in mind. Now, something else that is very important in these scenarios, and this especially is true in low stakes games where the rake is relatively high, but also some live games where the rake can be high, like because you have little fold equity if you raise, like there's a limper, you decide to raise it up, he's not going anywhere, so he is almost always going to make the call, maybe even other players join. Because you are going to see a flop almost all the time, you have to pay rake. And this has an impact on the strategy, of course, because you don't want to pay rake. If there's a possibility for you to not have to pay rake, especially pre-flop. Think of having fold equity pre-flop. If you have to pay the rake, you have to become tighter because the rake will have an impact on your overall winnings and how much you can win with a certain hand in a certain situation. So if you are guaranteed to pay the rake, your net winnings are lower basically, and therefore you have to adjust and become tighter. Now, I'm not going to talk right now about the adjustments. I'm first talking about realizations that we should make. But we should realize here that because we have little to no fold equity, if we raise it up, we are almost always going to pay rake here. Now, as mentioned, limpers are often found, in my experience, in the lower stakes games where rake is also high. Also in live games, there are a bunch of players who like to limp, especially recreational players do this a lot. There are other games and tendencies where this also happens. Sometimes it's not good to do. Sometimes it might even be good to do. But in general, the two main groups where this happens is at the low stakes and also in live games. Okay, now that we have talked a little bit about the realizations that we should have when we do face a limper, we shouldn't expect that much fold equity. We have to play a lot of multi-way pots, and we're also going to pay rake the majority of the time because we are going to see that flop if we raise it up here. So those three things are important. Now, there are different ways we can have a strategy against limpers. But in general, I recommend you to play somewhat of a tighter strategy, a tighter raising range than you would normally do from a given situation. So let's imagine you have a limper in early position, the MP player folds, you are in the cutoff. You generally are not wanting to raise as many hands as you should when you don't have a limper. And that is because if there are two players folding to you and you can raise it up here, you still have the chance to just take down the pot pre-flop without having to pay rake, win the blinds, and therefore move on to the next hand with a certain group of hands. But if there's already a limper in front of you, you have to already realize that you are going to see that flop almost always. And therefore you have to adjust your strategy because less fold equity means that some of our net winnings won't come to us basically. We're not gonna gather some of the net winnings because the rake has an impact there. And not only that, there's also the chance, of course, that more people come into the pot and we're suddenly going to play a multi-way pot with a lot of people in there instead of having the chance to raise it up pre-flop and getting fold equity. Now, secondly, what I also wanted to point out here is that I believe it's just the most common and a good default strategy for you to, if you face a limper, to just, if you decide to raise it up to full pot. It's very easy to implement. You're going to punish your opponents as much as possible because they have to invest more money and therefore they are making a larger mistake basically than if you raise small. Yes, you can also raise small. There are also some concepts and ideas behind that strategy, but I think for simplification and also to punish your opponents as much as possible, raise it up to full pot and you will do totally fine here. Now, another thing that I believe is very important here is to always realize like who is behind you. Like if you sit in the cutoff again and this time middle position limps and you decide to raise it up here or fold or maybe even also limp, like think about who is sitting behind you. If there are more regulars sitting behind you and you raise it up, it might be more successful for you to come through with your raise because these regulars, they are not going to do that much cold calling in those positions. Yes, they will sometimes come over the top with a 3-bet to punish your ISO raise, but at the same time, you won't have those players who have like a 50, 60, 70% VPIP who are going to cold call the majority of the time here, and you will end up either out of position if they, for example, call on the button, or going to be in a multi-web pot if they maybe call on the button or in the blinds there. So I see students of myself and also people, for example, players in the PLO mastermind, like if I review sometimes hands, I sometimes get the feeling that they don't really realize who are sitting actually behind them. And I think that's always good to get yourself familiar with the idea of always like start practicing, like looking around the table, like what are the tendencies? What are people doing here? If they face a raise, if they face an ISO raise, if they face a limper, like what is the tendency of a recreational player? What is the tendency of a regular here? How are they playing against each other here? And try to think ahead here and then adjust correctly. Now, lastly, also like position is always super beneficial in the majority of poker games, of course, but also especially in pot limit Omaha. So ISO raising from the button might be more beneficial, might be more profitable than if you ISO raise, for example, from middle position or the cutoff. Because first of all, you will end up less often in your multi-way pot because there are less people behind you to act, left behind you to act. And also because you're gonna be in position guaranteed post-flop, which is always super, super helpful, of course. Lastly, what I also see happening quite often is when there's a limper at the table that other people start to limp behind them. And I don't necessarily recommend doing that. And especially if you see this happening at low stakes where the rake is high. And if you are doing this currently, then realize that if you limp, you are actually going to pay the rake. And now that we know that if we raise it up, we still have not that much fold equity, of course, you're still going to punish your opponent at least by making a call there with a wide range of hands. Like people who limp, they often limp like 40, 50, 60% of the hands. So if they then are always going to call, then make sure to punish these guys by raising it up. If you do enter the pot, don't limp. Don't force yourself to pay the rake. Let them make the mistake and stop doing it yourself. Now, I hope these sort of quick tips and ideas, they give you some more clarification. There's no one fit strategy for every situation here. I think the majority are the most important realization that we can have today here is that fold equity is low and that we're going to play a lot of multi-way pots and maybe more than you expect. And secondly, that you want to play a strategy, or you want to at least have a strategy for yourself that makes sense in these situations. And in general, I like to use a strategy where I am raising slightly tighter from a certain position than I would normally do if I don't have a limper in front of me. So I recommend you to do the same there. Think of what raising frequencies are you holding in a certain situation, and then cut out a couple of percentages of those limps or of those raises if you face a limper, and raise a slightly tighter strategy there. Now, if you want to learn more about facing limpers, or if you want to talk strategy about facing limpers and playing in these games where there are a lot of loose passive opponents, then make sure to check out plomastermind.com. We have specific episodes for this topic. We also have a big community of players who play low stakes, mid stakes, high stakes, and who can definitely help you out if you are playing in these games and if you still have open questions here. Lastly, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give the video a thumbs up. That would be extremely helpful for myself. Feel free to share the video if you believe others are also capable of benefiting from this strategy and from this content. If you know people who play these games where there are a lot of limpers, then share the link, share the video, and spread the word basically, and help each other becoming better at pot limit Omaha. Okay, thank you very much everyone for watching. Hope to see you all soon here with another episode. GG, and have a great day, and good luck next time at the table. Bye bye.